Professor Lanier Anderson of Philosophy, here to talk to us on preparing and delivering the lecture. And although lectures still typify just about every discipline, and although we have very fine lecturers in every field on campus, philosophy, with its emphasis on clear, concise, and examined thinking, would seem to be an especially ideal background for someone who chooses to talk about lecturing. And indeed, Professor Anderson is a philosopher through and through. He completed his BA in philosophy summa cum laude from Yale University in 1987 and finished both a master's and a PhD in philosophy from the University of Pennsylvania in 1993, doing his dissertation on Nietzsche's epistemology. He then immediately launched into a teaching career, first as a lecturer at Penn, then as a visiting assistant professor at Bryn Mawr and Haverford, and subsequently here at Stanford. Here he was promoted to assistant professor in 1997, appointed a Marta Sutton Weeks faculty scholar in the humanities in 2001, and then last year was made an associate professor, though he spent his first few months as a Stanford associate professor by acting as a visiting associate professor at Harvard. And I'm particularly grateful that he actually accepted the invitation to speak here in our series when he was already back at Harvard, and when he could have begged off, and I'm so glad he didn't. Though early in his career, Professor Anderson has already made his mark as both a scholar and a teacher. He received an NEH Younger Scholars Award while he was still an undergraduate, was chosen a fellow at the Stanford Humanities Center in 2000-2001, has almost 20 publications in leading philosophy journals and other works, has been invited to lecture not only at Harvard, as I mentioned, but at Penn, the University of Toronto, the University of Wisconsin, UC Berkeley, and many other venues. On the teaching side, he has already won 3 awards, having been selected as Class Day Speaker at Stanford in 2002, as winner of the University Gores Award for Excellence in Teaching in 2003, and for the H&S Dean's Award for Teaching in 2003-2004. Colleagues and students who eagerly nominated him for these awards might wonder, along with me, if he was unconsciously describing the challenge of effective lecturing when he wrote the following words in an article with Josh Landy called Philosophy and Self-Fashioning. And so I am quoting. Life presents each of us with a bewildering variety of factors attaching to our person. There is no guarantee that such components will fit together without serious tension. Achieving selfhood in the strongest sense is a matter of creating a harmonious order of these elements, thereby fashioning a coherent way of life. And any of you who have tried to write a lecture probably appreciate any more how that seems to be a description of that process as well as our selfhood. So Professor Anderson, please.
Thank you very much. So thank you especially for inviting me here. It's an extremely intimidating invitation, and I'm sure that I wasn't the first one who tried to use some lame excuse like absence from campus as a reason not to say yes. It is a great honor to be here in this venue, and quite intimidating. And it's especially intimidating because right around the time that I got the invitation from Michelle to give this talk, I was just finishing up my spring IHUM course last year, which was the single biggest teaching disaster that I have ever perpetrated on any students anywhere. And so I felt singularly unworthy. But I must say the most nervous I ever was on getting an invitation to give a lecture was to give the Class Day talk in 2002 first the students just wrote me an email and they said, you know, don't you want to come give this talk to us? And I thought, isn't that cute? You know, the students want me to go give the talk, and I said yes. And then they sent me the list of the people who had done it before me, and that was when I really got terrified. So here I was, some assistant professor, and the list was full of people like, Gerhard Casper, Condoleezza Rice, Donald Kennedy. It was Bill Bradley who gave it the year before me. I mean, what was I doing there? I was an imposter. So I found the person on the list who had given the class day lecture the most times. And fortunately, I knew that guy. It was Hrant Kachadorian, who, according to his own account, has taught more Stanford undergraduates than anybody. He ran the Hum Bio major for a long time, and that's probably how he got that title. And one thing, so I took him to lunch at the faculty club, and I said, tell me what to do. And the first thing he said to me was that you should always start out with a story, and then they'll remember the rest of the lecture. So here's a story that my great uncle used to tell me when I first started teaching, and it was about his colleague at Johns Hopkins University, the great literary critic Leo Spitzer. Spitzer was one of the great literary critics of the 20th century, one of the great inheritors of the philological tradition, along with Auerbach, in the German world, German-speaking world. He had been teaching in Austria, but he fled the Anschluss, the Nazi Anschluss in Austria, to Turkey, where he had a bunch of students in '38. And as my uncle would tell the story, shortly thereafter, the long arm of Johns Hopkins reached out and snatched him up from Istanbul and brought him to Baltimore. Probably from Spitzer's point of view, it seemed a little different. He was, desperately trying to get to North America. But my uncle, too, had been at Hopkins only since the late 30s. He was still a relatively young teacher then. And he met Spitzer one day at the faculty club and started talking to him about a poetry seminar that he was doing. And Spitzer had some interest in that, even though he mainly had worked on continental literature, and my great uncle was teaching American literature. He said he had a kind of passing amateur interest in Whitman, and would my uncle be interested, he could come give a talk in the seminar. Spitzer came there, gave a talk to the students about Whitman, at which point the students in the seminar were blown away and spontaneously rose and stood and gave him a standing ovation, even though it's only 25 people or something, my uncle included. They were just completely awed by the performance of the great Professor Spitzer. Back at the faculty club the next week, my uncle, sort of sheepishly sat down at Professor Spitzer's table again and said, well, you kind of messed me up there. What am I going to do next week? And he asked him for advice about how to manage presentations in classes like that. And Spitzer must have said a bunch of things, but the only thing my great uncle remembered years later when he was telling me the story in the late 80s was that Spitzer said to him, young man, you must get it across the footlights. Now, what I took from that claim that, in lectures you have to get it across the footlights, is that giving a lecture is always one part show, and you can't forget to bring the show when you start out in lecturing. Another good moral of that story was that we can learn a lot of good things about teaching from talking to our elders, which is what I was trying to do when I took Hrant to lunch and got him to tell me how to manage that class day talk. But there are a lot of ways, and not just being incredibly charismatic and gifted like Leo Spitzer was, to pull students in and get them engaged with a course and with material. So one of my colleagues, Chris Babanich, who's an extremely effective lecturer in IHUM, has a sort of series of jokes that he plays with the students at the beginning of a course to kind of get them involved in the subject matter. One of his big agendas is to get students to realize that although they believe themselves to be complete relativists about value, and to think that everybody's values are relative to their own particular commitments, and that nobody has anything to say against anybody else for having the values that they do, he wants to get them to see that this belief about themselves is in serious tension with a lot of beliefs that they have about what in fact is good for people and bad for people. And so he plays this little joke on them. He asks the class early on, first or second lecture, whether the name Plato, which is the name of a very famous philosophical author, was a pseudonym or not. Anybody know the answer? So nobody knows the answer. It never fails with freshmen that nobody knows the answer. So he forces somebody to guess, right? They have a 50% chance of getting it right. And if they get it right, he throws candy at them. And then points out that, of course, everybody in the room sees that it's good for the person who got the candy, that they have the candy. Everybody agrees with that. Even though they think that all values are relative, blah, 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 they accept immediately that it's good for the person who got the candy. Of course, somebody gets it wrong, too, so before he gives the answer, he makes somebody say one answer and somebody say the other answer. And, the person who gets it wrong, he, comes up with some incredibly violent punishment that they're supposed to receive, inspired by Kill Bill or something. And gets the students to imagine this vividly and acknowledge that they have a clear sense that this is bad for the person. Of course, he makes some joke, right? He says, well, the first thing you'll think when I do this vicious punishment is, wow, the grading in this class is going to be harder than I thought. The second thing is, oh, bad for that person. Isn't it bad for that person? Now, that technique works, it seems to me, by involving students personally in the question that you're trying to get them across, to get across to them, but without, notice, singling them out on some personal matter, right? He doesn't exploit some really personal thing that they believe. He doesn't make anybody admit to anything that's close to their heart. It's some arbitrary question, like, whether Plato is a pseudonym, something that I'm sure none of his students actually remember the answer to by the end of the course. Part of the reason I'm sure is that I can't quite be sure I remember having heard him do this 4 or 5 times. I think it's a pseudonym. But there are lots of ways to get that kind of effect. So some people don't feel comfortable or are less excited by this sort of Kill Bill type example, and some students are put off by that sort of violent way of joking around, even in the imagination. Josh Landy and I, my co-author in that paper that Michelle was nice enough to quote, tried to make a similar point in an IHUM class by conducting a sort of mock auction on the first day of class based on this open letter that Bill Gates Sr. wrote several years ago about why we should keep the estate tax. And the basic argument was that Bill Gates would gladly give up a certain percentage of his income, 50% or whatever it is that's going to be taxed by the estate tax, paid on death in order to have had his life and his economic activity here instead of in some, third world kleptocracy or something where it would have been much harder for him to achieve the things that he achieved. So that was supposed to be an argument in favor of the estate tax. And, we wanted to get people to see that they really cared about the quality of their lives and that it mattered to them how good their lives were. And so we had a little auction, how much would you pay in terms of your lifetime, percentage of your lifetime income, to be in this country as opposed to some terrible situation driven by civil war and so forth. And, then we just got them to bid against each other, and the percentage kept going higher and higher and higher and higher until it finally became clear that there was one student who was going to outbid anybody. And the bidding stopped at, I think, 95% of the person's lifetime income. And you might think, okay, well, the person's planning to be a social worker or something like that. No. It was Josh Childress who won the bidding, who went in the lottery in the NBA draft last year. So he was talking about a lot of lifetime income that he was willing to give up to have a good life. So again, I think strategies like this work by getting students personally involved, where they imagine themselves into the situation or the problem or the point that is to be highlighted in the course. And I said before that I find it useful to try to figure out ways to do this without actually trying to exploit deep personal facts or beliefs of the student. let me take a little digression here for a minute. I do teach a course on existentialism where I use a lot of personal details about my own life. And I have gradually over the years sort of carved that back to essentially a single example or a few examples in that course that run from lecture to lecture. And part of that is in response to reaction from a certain small subset of students who are made deeply uncomfortable by knowing too much about their teacher. So that is something that you want to get the students personally involved, but you want to find a way to do that that doesn't cross a line that's going to make some students uncomfortable. So, end of digression. Of course, you can also get students involved in the material of the course in more straightforward ways by encouraging questions in the lecture, by using some techniques to get them to listen more actively to the lecture. And I'm going to talk a little more about techniques like that in a minute, but let me just say right here that I have found that if you don't do that kind of thing early in the quarter and get it established as something that the students can expect to encounter when they get to lecture, then you never can get people to be engaged. They'll sit there like lumps once they have the ingrained expectation that they're going to come there and you're going to talk at them for 50 minutes and they're not going to have to do anything. So it's good to get that pattern laid down early in the quarter. So let me talk for a minute about the general subject of active listening and participation on the part of the students in lecture courses, even large ones. So the major downside of the sort of traditional chalk and talk lecture of the sort that I'm exploring today and defending in some reactionary way, so we're not supposed to get rid of this chalk and talk lecture. It's not bad, not good pedagogy, very bad, etc. But and one reason that people do resist the traditional chalk and talk lecture is that it does have the downside that there's a tendency for the students to be less engaged in the process of their own learning. So, let me say on the one side, lectures like this can be very satisfying for the scholar teacher herself, because after all, we get intellectual rewards from thinking through the question and figuring out interesting features of the problem space and then being able to present that to the students. And it's very intellectually challenging and intellectually exciting and fun for us, the lecturers. But there is a hard truth that people like us need to remember, which is that teach is a success verb. That is, no one has been taught anything unless the student actually learned, right? And if the student didn't learn, then the whole lecture has been a failure, no matter how beautiful the idea was behind that lecture, and no matter how successful the thinking process of the writer of the lecture, if the students just check out mentally in the middle and don't remember anything, then the lecture was a failure. A failure. Now, one way of thinking about this point, which is really obvious once you consider it, but which I myself am constantly forgetting in the press of the quarter while I'm writing my lectures, is something that was first pressed on my attention, and after that first time, many later times, by Catherine Preston from the biology department. And that point is this, that the learning that happens in a class is not just a function of the amount of content that is presented in lecture. I'm always trying to up the amount of content that's presented in my lectures. The learning that happens in the class has to be understood instead as a product of the amount of content presented and the percent retained by the students. Typically, moreover, the big effect that you can get to change the amount of learning that's happening in your class is to change the percent retention, not to up the amount of content. And this is one of those cases in life where very often less is more. If you present less content, probably you're going to have a big effect on the percent retained, and you'll end up with a better overall result. And the real take-home message from this point, I think, is that it's crucial in giving lectures to maintain on the part of the audience active listening, even in these dreaded chalk and talk contexts where it's one person standing up there talking. You have to maintain active participation of the intellect on the part of the audience. Otherwise, you're not going to have the right value in the percent retention variable, and you're not going to succeed. So how to do that? Well, so here are a few things. I'll start with some relatively simple and low time cost measures for achieving this kind of effect. One kind of thing is that you should try to maintain eye contact with your audience. People are less likely to be zoned out or to be surfing the web, which is a big problem in these wired lecture halls, or doing their email or something like that if you're actually making eye contact with them while you're talking to them. Second, you should actually use the board instead of just standing in front of it, right? And my colleague at Harvard, Allison Simmons, is the great master of this technique. So she's constantly thinking in every lecture that she gets, okay, so when am I going to stand up and write something down on the board? And it's a way of just breaking up the attention of the audience. You move around, that makes them pay a little more attention. And you write something down on the board, they think to themselves, oh, I wonder if that's important. Maybe I should write it down too, and then this is good. And so when I actually was a substitute teacher for Allison when I was in Harvard for one of her classes, and she gave me the notes that she had for that lecture. And the whole thing was this incredible color-coded thing with all of these, red and purple and blue and green circles around the text that she had word processed. And it was all these notes to herself about when she was going to get up and use the board, and about what kinds of things she was going to write on the board and what kind of things she was going to walk around the room and so forth. And another sort of technique that my colleague Chris Babonich uses to great effect is to walk around the room. And one thing I learned in that terrible IHUM class that I taught was that this can be extremely effective. So if you've got students who actually just talk in your lecture, one thing that's very effective is you just keep lecturing and you just walk over and stand right next to where they're talking, and that will usually shut them up. So these are all pretty simple, low cost in terms of your own time in presenting material methods. So it's not going to take you any longer to present the thing if you make eye contact, not much longer if you use the board or if you walk around and so forth. So maybe now we go a little bit more, you're sacrificing some of the content you wanted to present because it takes a lot of time to do this. These techniques are a little more time intensive. So student questions. That's what I was saying before. It's good early on in the quarter to make it clear that you want to be interrupted, that you want to answer questions from the students. And if you spend some time doing that, the students will be more engaged in what's happening in the lecture. Now, especially for more advanced classes, there's a technique that I heard about a biologist at Indiana University, Kurt Lively, using, which you should, I guess, think of as the pretending not to know strategy of soliciting student questions. So you get some student question, then you pretend that you had never thought of that before and you don't have any idea what the answer is. And then you can get some kind of actual discussion going, and that can be especially effective for bringing students into the life of the problem. So they sort of see that even this person who's thought about it a lot has no idea what the answer is to this question, and then this is good. They feel like they're out at the frontier of knowledge, and they can feel like they're really engaged in the class. Now, of course, in some cases, that happens a lot for me, that Kurt Lively pretending not to know strategy is actually forced on us because we don't, in fact, know the answer. And that was, I have an especially bad memory of that in one of my existentialism lectures where I had worked really hard to figure out this argument, and I thought I had finally nailed it. And I went into class, and I presented it, and one of our graduate students, who was my TA in the class, Simon May, raised his hand in the front row and said, no, that can't work because blah, 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 blah. The entire lecture just was crumbling in front of me. And it's important not to lose those chances. That was a teaching moment. And it was important for the students to see my lecture just crumble, right, under the objection of one of the students in the class, because then they could see that no, this was a question that they themselves could get involved in, to which the answer was not known. And we got more papers about that paper topic than any other topic that time, because people were really charged up about that question. But even if you don't get lucky enough actually to be caught out being completely ignorant, then you can still pretend, like Kurt Lively does, not to know the answer. And then, as you go down, maybe there's some even higher time cost strategies that are sort of deliberately devised discussion-promoting mechanisms in the class. And I mean, the main one I'm going to talk about here is the breakout, which I first learned about in a teaching presentation by Russ Fernald, actually, which was a really amazing presentation. And what he started doing in his classes was that he would pose some problem to the class, and they would say, okay, now this is a breakout. Get with the two people on either side of you and work out a solution to this problem. And then after 5 minutes, they would come back to the group, and he would call on 3 or 4 of these groups to present their solutions, and then there would be a little bit of discussion in the class, and then they would move on. Now that's going to take, in my experience, somewhere between 12 and 20 minutes to carry out in a really effective way, because you want to consider a couple of the solutions that small groups came up with, and you really have to give them some time, 3, 4, 5 minutes to talk about the question you posed. But it does get students actively involved in thinking about the questions in the class. And again, with this technique, I have found in my own experience that this works a lot better if you try one early in the quarter, and then you can come back to it again later. If you try introducing this thing after you've already been lecturing to them 3 times a week for 6 weeks, they're going to think it's arbitrary, and you're being mean to them, and they're going to feel like they're put upon, and then they won't really do it in a fully participatory way. There are lots of other sort of discussion exercise techniques of this sort, where you pose a concrete exercise for discussion to the students in class time. Imagination is really the only limit for the different ways you can think up to do that, and so I won't try to go through a list of all those things. One final strategy I will mention that's not quite as time intensive as breakouts is I've tried with mixed success, sometimes with great success, sometimes with poor success. A technique I read about on the door of one of my graduate school professors, which is to stop the lecture early, 2 minutes early maybe, 3 minutes early, and do a writing exercise where you stop the lecture and you say, okay, everybody sit down and write 2 sentences maximum about what the main idea of this lecture was. And if you tell them that you're going to do that every class meeting, it can, and that's the good way, it can affect the way they listen to the lectures, because they will actually be trying to figure out while they're listening what the main point of the lecture is. And that can be a good exercise. Sometimes, well, so here's a pitfall. One time when I was teaching IHUM, one of the TFs very strongly felt that there should be pressure on attendance in lecture, and we attached it to this exercise, and then they didn't learn anything from this exercise. They just resented it. It was like taking attendance, and they were pissed. Okay, so a couple of words about presentation proper. The main thing that I will say here is, I'll contrast 2 main choices. You can write out the whole thing in sentences and read it, or you can speak from an outline or from bullet points or from slides or something like that. Those are 2 different ways that you can go. And in my view, there's really not one answer here. Each person needs to find a strategy that's going to fit with their own style. But I used to only speak from outlines, and I was very resistant to writing things out. And then later on in my life, I started writing things out because it helped me prepare from year to year. It saved me a lot of time, and I felt like I was making new progress in my classes instead of just covering the same ground again. But there are pitfalls from writing things out in full sentences and fully articulating your thoughts about things. And I would suggest that people not to do that unless they're really comfortable and they're sure that they will be comfortable to depart from the text that they have written down in the lecture, because the main, spontaneity is really key in these lectures, and the main pitfall that people have is that, you write the thing out, you start reading it, and you're paying attention to which word is next, and not even what the sentence means, and then everybody just zones out, and I mean, we've all heard lectures that were read in that way, and it's, hard even to stay awake. So it's important when you're reading not to sound like you're reading. And, I don't know, subjectively, the way I try to avoid that is to be thinking the sentence really from the inside while I'm reading it and not just looking for the words. But in order to do that, you have to know where that sentence is going, and you're not going to be surprised by the end of it. And one thing that had gone terribly wrong in that IHUM course last year that I'm still traumatized about is that I had agreed, for reasons that I won't go into, and I'm never going to agree to do this again, to have a meeting right before class, both days. And as a result, I wasn't spending the hour right before class going over the lecture. And so it wasn't sufficiently internalized, and I would get lost in there, and I would start to sound like I was reading, and it was a catastrophe. It was a catastrophe. So you should spend the hour before your class preparing your class. Tell those people no. Right? The TFs wanted to meet right before the class because that's when it's convenient for them, but I'm sorry, next time, no, I'm never doing that again. Okay, and then last point about that, and this is a lesson I learned from one of my graduate teachers. It's really a good lesson for those of us who started teaching and have been doing it for 5 or 10 years by now. It's very tempting after a while, you teach the same course for the 3rd or 4th or 5th time, not to do the reading, because you know those texts very well, but I went over to dinner to this professor's house, and his partner was there, and she taught at another institution somewhere else, and she told me she just couldn't believe it, how much time he spent on his teaching, because he was doing all the reading for every course over again every time, even though it was the 20th time he had taught this course. But if you don't do that, it's not fresh, and then the lectures are bad. So yeah, some days you can't do it. It's a sublunary world, and sometimes you can't do it, but it has a cost when you don't do it. So the Gary Hatfield lesson is that you have to keep doing the reading even when you're an advanced and accomplished teacher like he was. So last point about presentation proper. Students often like visual aids, like that handout that I passed over, or overheads or something like that, slides, something like that. Students often like that, and if you don't have a handout, students in large lecture courses will often complain that they're not getting the handout. And what they really want, of course, is not to have to take notes, and they want the handout to be able to substitute for their notes. And I don't really like that. And so I tend to make handouts or overheads when I do with just the very broadest layer of the outline there, where lots of details are to be filled in, and then they have to actually be thinking to select which details they're going to write down in their notes, and I think that helps keep them more involved. But I tell you, the best handouts on this campus are made by Josh Landy. He makes awesome handouts. And what he gives them is, all of the evidence that they can use to make their own argument about the text that he's telling them about. He gives them this incredibly rich array of quotations, and then a pretty rough and abstract outline of what he said about this evidence. And those handouts are really quite beautiful. I wish I could do it as well as he does. All right, so part 2 of the lecture, preparation and structuring of the lecture. And I want to talk for a couple of minutes about 2 main models of writing a lecture that I have found helpful and interesting for myself. The first model is a clear lecture with a few main points that can, as it were, be numbered. And you can put those on the handout on the outline. And then you're going through those points. And you can even say on the outline, what the logical relation is between these points. And so. Point 1, and so. Point 2, blah, blah, blah. And the master of this kind of lecture is our former colleague, Peter Godfrey Smith. He was just amazing at it. He would come there to the biology department where he was going to give a lecture, and he would give a talk based on a paper with 9 sections, and he would put up on the board you know, the 9 points that he was going to make, and then stand there with his hands in his pockets and go through the 9 points, explaining what was important about each one and how they were related to each other. Really beautiful, very luminous way of giving a lecture. The second kind of model for writing and structuring the thing, and this is a vice. I'm really given to this one, and I use it even when I shouldn't. I think of it as a reticulated structure. It's a much more complex thing where you identify several different strands, which are then going to come, which you distinguish from one another, and then they're then all going to come together at the end. So I think of it as a kind of reticulated or net-like structure that's sort of pulled together at the end, usually by a sort of surprise twist to the end of the lecture, and then the students say, aha, now I see how those things are all related that were talked about earlier. But it's harder to pull that off, and it's especially harder to make it clear what's happening in the lecture, and that's why I say it's a vice that I'm so given to it. I use it even when probably I would be better advised not to. So some advantages and drawbacks of these two strategies. The first strategy, the few points strategy, one of the main advantages of it is that it's easier to bring out the main points of interest, and then you get better evaluations on that. One question CTL asked about whether you distinguish between more and less important topics, which I always get downgraded on, because I'm not good at that. But it's easier if you have those PGS-like lectures. PGS is Peter Godfrey Smith. If you have the Peter Godfrey Smith type lectures, it's easier to bring out the main points, and that helps you to increase the percent student retention number, and it provides organization for the students, and it gives them something to hang the information on. So, for example, you say that in lecturing, it's important to present things in an engaging way and also to prepare a structure that is very nice and that will allow the information to be accessible for the students. And then within point 1, of course, you suggest that there are various specific techniques that you might adopt to engage the students on a personal level, and that you need to promote active listening, and that there are various things you can do to improve that, maintain eye contact, right? So there are a few points that you can bring out that way, and in that way you can maintain clarity for the students about what the several points are that you emphasize during the talk. With the reticulated structure, the main disadvantage is that you lose the advantages of the other idea. But the main advantage is that if it works and you really pull off the surprise twist, you leave them thinking about something, and you create an impression in the audience that really there's more to figure out about this topic, and that I should think about it more. And that's, especially in the humanities, a lot of what we're trying to accomplish with our lectures. And so I tend to think of what you're going for here on the model of the movie The Usual Suspects. I don't know if people know that movie, but it's a very surprising ending, and the ending changes the meaning of everything that happened earlier in the movie. So that the experience that you have when you're walking out of the theater is, I've got to see it again, because you want to go back and see how all the things that you thought you knew as you were going through the movie turn out to have a different underlying meaning. And that's a big part of how people in the humanities think. We're really into texts that have a sort of exoteric structure on the surface and that really means something more complicated and deeper inside. That's what we're attracted to, and so people like me are sort of given to the vice of structuring our lectures that way. So which should you pick? Well, you should pick the one that's appropriate to the particular material you have to deliver that day. Right? And that's how you should pick. It's not always easy to tell what that is, but that's how you should choose. So let me make one additional point about these two methods. In both cases, it's important to remember the importance of explicitness, of being extremely clear and explicit about what the important points in the lecture are. But that's especially important in the reticulated structure, where you might be relying in the surprise twist ending on some kind of shock effect or something like that. It's very important that you remember to yourself the whole time the importance of being clear and explicit about what the take-home message was supposed to be. And there are lots of ways you can do this. You know, you can mark out the headlines of the main points you want to make. You know, you have some little gesture. So sometimes I talk about it this way, that, you know, a philosopher, when they're about to make their main point, they say, well, notice this is my main point, and this is like waving the flag. So here it goes. You know, this is my main point. Pay attention right here. So you can do that. My colleague Michael Bratman has this beautiful technique of walking in at the beginning of the class and writing the main points up on the board. And then right in front of the students the whole time. And he doesn't always refer back to that, but it's right in front of them the whole time, and they can sort of see it while you're going through. So that's another way of helping to distinguish between more and less important parts of the information you're conveying. But the most important thing is to make the logical structure of the thing explicit. And that's really challenging with the reticulated kind because, you know, you've got this thought that there are complicated and multifarious relations among the strands that you're trying to put down, and you want students to think about the relations between them in a different way after the ending. That's how the structure really works. And what's good about that is that it can help to convey the sense of discovery, because they learn that, they experience that they learned something new about these questions that you were raising already at the beginning of the lecture. But again, if you don't make it clear by the end what the logical relation among the different strands of the argument was supposed to be, then you lose the effect. And, you know, last point, you know, it's very important with that structure that you watch your time, because if you have structured the whole lecture that way so that it doesn't mean anything until the ending, and then you don't get there, well, then this is bad. This point that even the reticulated type of lecture with the more or less surprise ending really needs to be made totally explicit in terms of its internal logical structure gives me an opportunity to share with you the most impressive thing I've read about teaching in a long time, maybe the most impressive thing ever. It's a New Yorker essay by Adam Gopnik that was in the May 10th, 2004 issue and won the National Magazine Prize, in fact, for the best essay that year in a magazine. And it's a personal essay about Adam Gopnik's friend, the late art historian Kirk Varnedoe, and it's called Last of the Metrozoids, A Teacher's Final Lesson. So, you know, if you didn't see that thing, run. Do not walk, run to the library and get hold of this. It's really a moving piece. And it looks at Varnedoe's teaching work during the last year of his life. It's announced in the first paragraph, so I'm not spoiling anything, that that Varnedoe is dying of cancer during the time that Gopnik is talking about. And it looks at his teaching work during the last year of his life, culminating in a series of Mellon lectures that he gave at the National Gallery of Art in spring 2003 on abstract art. And the main conceit of the piece is to view Varnedoe as a teacher against the background of his role as a coach of this pickup football team made up of 8-year-olds called the Giant Metrozoids, one member of which is Gopnik's son, Luke. Now, Varnedoe was apparently an incredibly, incredibly charismatic teacher with this simply astounding knowledge and erudition and insight and ability to explain artworks. And, not without saying, shouldn't go without saying, that he seems to have been an immensely compelling personality. And it's tempting to think, in part based on cases like Varnedoe, that truly good teaching, truly great teaching, is essentially tied to personal charisma on the part of the teacher. And that view is especially tempting when the lecturer can pull some surprise ending out of the bag at the end of the hour that really makes you see things in a new way. And it's tempting to see the subject matter and the lecture itself as something mysterious and amazing when you can really pull that kind of ending off. But it's an illusion. It's an illusion. And Gopnik really brings out why that's an illusion. What made Varnedoe a truly amazing teacher was not at all that he was charismatic and had disciples, or that he made things mysterious and amazing. On the contrary, it was the fact that he was able to cut through the chaff and bring out the essence clearly and with total explicitness. That's what made him great. So I give you a little quotation from the little teaser from this article. It's on the handout. So remember, the conceit is, comparing him as a teacher and as a coach. Watching him on Metrozoid Field, you could see what made him a great teacher on bigger questions for bigger kids. Football was a set of steps. Art was a set of actions. The mysterious, the baffling things, modern art, the zone defense, weren't so mysterious or baffling if you broke them down. By the end of spring practice, the 8-year-olds were instinctively rotating out of man-to-man and into a zone, and the offense audibling out of a spread formation into the halfback option, just as the grown-ups in Washington were suddenly seeing the differences between Pollock's drips and Twombly's scrawls. It is said sometimes that the great teachers and mentors, the rabbis and the gurus, achieved their ends by inducting the disciple into a kind of secret circle of knowledge and belief, making of their charisma a kind of gift. The more I think about it, though, the more I suspect that the best teachers, and for that matter, the best coaches, all these people, do something else. They don't mystify the work and offer themselves as a model of rabbinical authority, a practice that nearly always lapses into a history of acolytes and excommunications. Think here of deconstruction. The real teachers and coaches may offer a charismatic model. Maybe they have to. But then they insist that all the magic they have to offer is a commitment to repetition and perseverance. The great oracles may enthrall, but the really great teachers demystify. They make particle physics into a series of diagrams that anybody can follow, football into a series of steps that anyone can master, and art into a series of slides that anybody can just see. A guru gives us himself and then his system. A teacher gives us his subject and then ourselves. Now that's good. That's good. This is, so that's a nice little teaser, but it really gets good at the end, this paper. And I really encourage you to go take a look. All right, so let me wind down by mentioning quickly 4 general points that can help bring that kind of explicitness into the structure of planned out, pre-written lectures. First, I think it's important over the course of a series of lectures to give students an overview with some background that will enable them to place the details that you can't talk about, that they find for themselves in the reading or in talking to the section leaders or in talking to you afterwards. You should think of the overall course and also think of each particular lecture as this layered structure with where you give them the basic outline and then they can fill in more details for themselves, partly from your lecture, but partly from their own work that they're doing outside. So it's important to keep that overview in focus. Also, it's crucial, I think, to give people examples of what you want them to do with the details. So you're not going to give them these examples with every detail, but with some details, you should put a text up on the overhead and go through it with them. So you show them how you want them to interpret and read and parse the argument and so forth. And you should make your method explicit when you're doing this. So it's not supposed to be like deconstruction. When I took a lot of classes from deconstructionist literary critics back at Yale in the day, and they would exemplify their methods for you, but they would never make them explicit. And that's what made the whole thing feel so much like a church, right? And that's why people end up being excommunicated. You should make your methods explicit. If you can't make your method explicit, then you should question whether it's honestly legitimate as a method. Third point, create some continuity in the course from lecture to lecture by reminding the students, okay, last time we left off with this idea, and now we're going to go here, right at the beginning. And then at the end, next time I'm going to do such and such. That creates continuity across the course from lecture to lecture, sort of linking the ones up individually. And then, of course, at the level of the whole course, I find, anyway, that it's important to tell a story, that the course should have a kind of arc where the overall body of information that you're conveying in the whole series of lectures has a kind of internal unity and integrity, or at least the relations among the parts can be specified in some way. And you can use some key moments in lectures to remind students of what that story arc is. And I mean, I just, from personal experience, the only undergraduate courses of lectures that I remember anything about were ones that had that kind of structure across the whole course. So you should tell a story in the course as a whole. Okay, last point. So I want to close my plea for the old, tired chalk and talk form, which, for all its warts, is, after all, time-tested, time-honored. I want to close my defense, my apology for the chalk and talk, with a plea to revitalize this form, to use this form, to bring our students along, and to genuinely advance the mission of the university as such. We should not just be trying to convey information with our lectures. We should be trying to bring our students into the pursuit of knowledge themselves, to try to give them a sense of what the whole enterprise is for, what it's about, and why we are engaged in it and care about it. And so I leave you with this one last story. When I first started teaching at Haverford College back in Pennsylvania, I was supposed to teach 2 courses. It was 6 hours a week. And then I heard this guy talking on the radio. He was a state legislator, a lawyer from Pennsylvania. And I don't know if you people know, in Pennsylvania, the state government actually gives lots of subvention to even private universities because there's only the one big state system, and then Penn and Temple and Pitt and all these other private or semi-private universities get lots of money from the state. And this guy wanted to tie that state funding to rules that would make the universities more public-friendly and more student-friendly. And the main one he wanted to push was that he just felt like the least these people could do was put down a rule that all the professors, even the fancy senior people, should at least teach their students in class 12 hours per week. Of course, they have all these other things to do in life, and they want to write their papers and everything, and that's good, and we want them to do that too, but the least we can expect is 12 hours a week. I wanted to kill this man because I had just finished teaching 6 hours a week, which cost me 28 contact hours with students that week. 28 contact hours, and then, the preparation. So I had been working 70 hours that week to try to get my 6 hours together. And I wanted to kill him. I really, I wanted to drive out to Western Pennsylvania where he lived. But then I realized, this man, ladies and gentlemen, was a lawyer. He had been in the university for 7 years, and he left with no bloody idea what we do. That's sad. And we should not let our students leave. And we have them here to brainwash them for 4 years. This is a propaganda opportunity like nobody's business. And we should show them what the enterprise of pursuing knowledge is really all about. So that's what I think we should use those Chalk and Talk lectures for. All right, I'm done. Yeah, I'll take questions. I'm sorry I went over my time limit, so I'm happy to stay for 15 minutes or so, as long as we can. Yeah.
Are there any fundamental differences in approaching a lecture for 200 students as opposed to 20?
Yeah. Well, for 200 students, it's harder to get across the footlights. You have to project more. You have to act more. You do have to strategize more. I think you should be more deliberate, and you can't be quite as spontaneous about the way you let student participation in the lecture happen. It's not that you should cut off spontaneity, but I guess the main thing I would think is, in a big lecture like that, students will think that they're invisible and that they don't have to participate. And so you have to design things that force it on them. And again, my main advice about that is you have to start early in the quarter so that they know going in that this is what's coming. And that way they don't get resentful and start springing on them. I guess that's my main piece of advice about that. It's good to try to get a sense of the space that you're in also. When I first came to Stanford, I participated in the former Civ, and to get a sense of what the course was about, I went to some of the lectures of the people who were doing it before me, and there was somebody up there in Annenberg Auditorium using the board, and I was sitting in the back row, and you couldn't see anything. And I sort of knew what it was supposed to be like, and I couldn't even discern it. And all the students around me were passing notes and talking. So, it's important to make sure that you have some sense of what the space is going to be like on those sort of practical levels too. Yeah.
Would you mind giving us an example of a topic that you would choose to address through a reticulated structure, and give us a sense of why you choose that?
Okay, so here's one thing that I realized when I was writing this talk is that my talk pretty well had the number of points structure. Gottmik's paper has the reticulated structure. Gottmik wanted to get people to feel that basic point that I was quoting him making. He wanted to get people to feel how really great teaching is not charisma gifting. It's demystification. And so he uses this beautiful device in the essay in order to get that point across. And it's interesting because he said it in that he made it as an argument in the quote that I gave you. It's pretty compelling right there. But when you read the essay, you end up believing it like religion. And it's interesting because you get the feeling that the charisma was really there, while at the same time seeing that the real point of it was demystification. And so now I give you the little device that so I break down for you the device that he used to get this. So early on in the article, he talks about how he and Kirk got to be friends because they were football fans, and they had this little joke between them for years that they had missed the Miami BC football game with this miraculous ending where Doug Flutie threw the Hail Mary pass and they won on the last play. They missed the game because their wives took them out looking at Shaver furniture. And, so they had this joke, whenever they would call each other up on the phone, and, it'd be something you really wanted to do together, but, you couldn't because, the wife's not going to let you. You just say, Miami, BC. And then, go on. The last week of Kirk Varnedo's life, his wife had to go out of town, out of the city on business. Gottmik came over to stay with him because, it was this last week. He was really dying and needed something to do. And it turned out, bloody hell, the Miami BC game was being rebroadcast on ESPN Classic. And they're watching the game. And they get to the last play. And they're like, oh, this is amazing. And Varnado goes, look at that. What? The safety just blew the coverage. There was no miracle. The safety just misread the play, didn't see Flutie was going to have time to set his feet, and so assumed that the pass could go maximally 15 yards shorter than it could. And so he read the pattern wrong, he took the wrong angle, and the guy was wide open. There was no miracle. It was just the play that you made. Now that's great, right? You come to see this point, and you see the greatness of it. And then he says, Varnado explained it to them, and then he sat back on the couch with a smile as happy as I've ever seen. Because what's great about life is not to be mystified. What's great about life is to see how it works. And so So that's a point that is well made by the reticulated structure, because you really see this guy break it down, and you feel the effect, the emotional power of the fact that he could break it down, because it's such a surprise twist in the end. But you also see how it worked. Do you see that, Gopnik led you in, right? He set you up by telling the story about the shaker furniture and everything earlier on. So, that way the essay kind of exemplifies at a higher level the very process that it's trying to get people to see as really important. So that's the kind of thing you can do with this reticulated structure that's hard to do with the PGS knowledge. But, this essay is a piece of genius. And, my lectures usually are not a piece of genius. And so sometimes I use it when I really shouldn't.
Well, we have reached the end of our time. So thank you so very much.
Thank you.